I was chained in the dark below a ship's deck. 6 days earlier, I had been kneeling in prayer. I believed my faith would protect me. Then the Vikings came. They killed the monks. They burned the altar. And they chose a different fate for us. This is the story of the women the Viking Age began with, and why no one came to save them. I was chained up deep in the belly of a ship. The stench of rotting fish filled the air and scraped my throat every time I tried to breathe. I couldn't see a thing down there, not even my own hands, but I could hear the sea slamming against the wooden hull and the low, broken cries of other women trapped beside me. Just 6 days earlier, I had been kneeling in prayer inside the monastery at Lindisfarne. 6 days ago, I was a consecrated virgin, given to God, believing my faith was a shield that would keep me safe. I learned the hard way that that sense of protection was nothing more than a comforting lie. The men from the north came out of the morning fog. They butchered the monks right on the altars where those men had prayed for decades. They cut their throats as they begged for mercy, stripped the place of gold, and set fire to sacred manuscripts that had taken lifetimes to create. But when they reached me, they chose a different fate. They didn't kill me. Instead, they shackled me, dragged me across the sand, and tore off my habit in front of everyone so they could judge my age and my body. I was 15 years old, and in that moment, I learned something terrifying about the northern lands. They had a special kind of slave. They called it frilla Christina, a Christian captive, ideally a nun, ideally untouched. To the Vikings, there was no greater triumph over the Christian god than taking women devoted to him and turning them into permanent concubines. As the ship pushed north toward Norway, a journey that would take weeks, what waited at the end was something the Catholic Church would spend the next 1,000 years trying to bury and erase from memory. This is the story of the 23 nuns taken from Lindisfarne in the year 793, the event that marks the beginning of the Viking Age. And the most horrifying part isn't even what was done to them. It's the fact that no one came to save them. Not Christian kings. Not bishops. Not even the parents who had sent their daughters to the monastery believing it was the safest place on earth. Everyone knew what the Vikings did to captives, and still, everyone chose silence. If this story pulls you in, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing back the voices history tried to smother. But before you can understand what the Vikings did to these women, you first need to understand what they lost that morning. June 8, 793 AD, just after dawn. Lindisfarne sat off the coast of Northumbria in England, one of the holiest places in all of Christendom. It held the relics of Saint Cuthbert and had been a center of prayer and scholarship for more than a century and a half. Inside the monastery lived 47 monks and 23 nuns, surrounded by treasures gathered over generations. Gold chalices. Silver crosses. Manuscripts decorated with jewel-covered bindings. Reliquaries holding the bones of saints. There had been rumors. Stories of pagan raiders from the north hitting coastal villages. But Lindisfarne was sacred ground. The monks believed God himself stood guard over it. That morning, the fog was heavy and thick. The watchman in the tower saw nothing until it was far too late. 30 ships, their prows carved into dragon heads, slid out of the gray mist like something pulled straight from a nightmare. By the time the alarm bells began to ring, the Vikings were already on shore. They didn't negotiate. They didn't demand surrender. They didn't even stop to look around. They attacked without hesitation. The first monks who rushed toward the beach, thinking traders had arrived, were killed with their hands raised in greeting. Axes split their skulls before they could even understand what was happening. The Vikings moved fast and without emotion. This wasn't new to them. They knew exactly what they were there for, and they knew exactly where to go. Some stormed the church. Others went straight for the treasury. Others headed for the sleeping quarters. Any monk who tried to fight back was cut down on the spot. Those who tried to escape were hunted through the cloisters. Those who hid were ripped from their hiding places and slaughtered in the courtyard. Father Aldwin, the abbot, was found kneeling at the altar, deep in prayer. They cut off his head right where he knelt. His blood soaked into the same stone floor where he had celebrated Mass for 30 years. The entire raid was over in less than 4 hours. By midday, Lindisfarne was quiet. All 47 monks were dead. Every last one of them. But the 23 nuns were still alive. And that was when the real nightmare began. The Vikings didn't take women at random. They followed a system. To understand why the Vikings went out of their way to take nuns, you have to understand how Scandinavian society worked in the 8th century. In many ways, Norse women actually had more legal rights than women elsewhere in Europe. They could own and inherit land, divorce their husbands, and take part in trade. But alongside that freedom existed a formal system of slavery. In Norse law, slaves were called thralls, and not all thralls were treated the same. Most were used for farming or household labor. But there was a specific class known as ambat, female slaves who were also expected to serve as permanent sexual partners. And at the very top of that category were frilla Christina, Christian slaves, especially nuns. There were 2 reasons they were so prized. The first was religious humiliation. The Vikings were devout pagans who worshipped gods like Odin and Thor, and they took particular pleasure in desecrating what Christians held most sacred. A nun had sworn a lifetime vow of chastity. She had given her body and her future to Christ. Turning her into property wasn't just conquest, it was a symbolic victory, a way of proving that the Norse gods were stronger than the Christian one. The second reason was practical. Nuns were educated, which was rare at the time. Many could read and write Latin, and some even knew Greek. They understood medicine through herbal knowledge, advanced weaving, and basic bookkeeping. As slaves, they were valuable in multiple ways: domestic labor, reproduction, and intellectual work. So while smoke still rose from the burning monastery at Lindisfarne, the Vikings began choosing who would live and how. They stripped the nuns naked and inspected them like animals at a market. Teeth were checked. Skin was examined for disease. Ages were guessed. Abbess Elfrida, 52 years old, was judged too old to be useful. They cut her throat right there. Her blood soaked into the same beach where the other women were forced to kneel and watch. The remaining 22 were sorted. The youngest and most physically desirable, around 8 of them, were set aside for a ritual the Vikings called blodband, or blood marriage. The rest, older or less attractive, were assigned as common ambat, domestic slaves with additional obligations. One girl, identified in a fragmented 9th century manuscript as Hilda, was only 15 years old. She would be among the 8 chosen for blood marriage. None of them knew what that meant yet. They would find out. The 3-week journey to Norway wasn't just a voyage, it was a deliberate campaign to break them down. The Vikings didn't touch the chosen nuns right away. Not on the ships, at least. Those marked for blood marriage were kept chained below deck in the cargo holds, cramped, dark spaces thick with the smell of saltwater and rotting fish. They were fed scraps, moldy bread and dried fish so salty it burned going down. They were forced to relieve themselves where they sat. No privacy. No washing. No relief. It was a calculated effort to erase who they were, stripping away the identity they had spent years building inside the monastery. The warriors came often, but not to rape them. Not yet. Instead, they humiliated them in other ways. They forced the nuns to speak blasphemies against Christ. They cut off their hair that had been kept long beneath veils as a sign of consecration, and tossed it into the sea. They made them drink strong beer until they vomited, shattering their vows of sobriety. They forced them to watch pagan sacrifices, animals slaughtered, and their blood splashed over wooden idols carved to Thor and Freya. Every act sent the same message: your God did not save you, your vows mean nothing, and the life you believed in can be erased. Today, psychologists call this process learned helplessness. In the 1960s, researcher Martin Seligman showed that when people learn that nothing they do can change their situation, they eventually stop trying. They don't give up because they're weak. They give up because their minds are trying to survive. First, you resist. Then you realize resistance doesn't work. Then you stop resisting. And finally, you stop feeling. That's what was happening in those ship holds. The nuns were being systematically broken, not with violence yet, but with degradation, isolation, and endless uncertainty. By the time the ships reached Norway, most of them had already surrendered internally. That was the goal. What comes next is so disturbing that the Catholic Church spent centuries destroying records that mentioned it. Subscribe, because Crown and Dagger doesn't turn away from history's darkest corners. When the ships finally reached the Norwegian coast, likely a fjord somewhere near the Hordaland region, the next stage began. The nuns were unloaded and taken to structures the Norse called thralleris, slave houses, wooden buildings where captives were processed before being distributed to their final owners. Once they reached the slave houses, the women were washed for the first time in weeks. This wasn't kindness. Vikings believed their property should be kept clean. After that, older Norse women examined them carefully. These women knew how to judge fertility, dental condition, signs of disease, and physical strength. Based on those inspections, each nun was categorized. The 8 youngest and most physically desirable were set aside for bloodband, blood marriage. This was a complicated ritual described in the Icelandic sagas, though the sources tend to soften or skip the worst parts. The ceremony took place during Blot, a religious festival held 3 times a year. The captive was led to a horgr, a stone altar in a forest clearing considered sacred ground. She was naked, her hands bound behind her back. The local leader, the jarl or hirsur, stood before her wearing ceremonial armor. Between them stood a godi, a pagan priest, who conducted the rite. The first act was the sacrifice of a horse, an animal sacred to Odin. The priest caught the blood in a bronze bowl and mixed it with fermented mead. The captive was forced to drink it while the godi chanted invocations to Freyja and Frigg, goddesses tied to fertility and marriage. Then the jarl cut his own palm with a ritual blade and made the captive cut hers as well. Their bleeding hands were pressed together while the priest bound them with a leather cord. In Norse belief, this created an unbreakable spiritual bond. The final stage was public and deliberately brutal. The jarl claimed the captive on the stone altar while the community looked on. This wasn't passion. It was worship. Onlookers sang hymns to Freyja, banged shields in rhythm, and drank mead. When it ended, the jarl smeared her blood across her forehead, marking her as his frilla. Depending on how many additional rites the priest demanded, the full ceremony could stretch on for hours. For the nuns taken from Lindisfarne, this moment erased everything they had been. They had spent years, some of them decades, training themselves for spiritual purity. They memorized psalms, fasted regularly, and even punished their own bodies to suppress desire. Their entire identity rested on virginity as a holy offering. Now that virginity was stripped away in a pagan ritual designed specifically to desecrate what they held sacred. Many fought back, screaming prayers in Latin, calling on the Virgin Mary. The Vikings took that resistance as proof the ritual was working. To them, it meant the power of the Christian God was being broken. After blood marriage, life as a frilla Christina followed a set pattern. She lived in her master's household, usually in a separate room from his legal wife, but still within the same family compound. She belonged to him completely. He could take her whenever he wished, and she had no right to refuse. Alongside that, she was expected to work, spinning, weaving, cooking, tending gardens, caring for children. Nuns who could read and write were often given extra duties, managing trade records, teaching children, preparing herbal remedies. Pregnancy was constant and unavoidable. Vikings prized fertility and believed large families brought prosperity. A pregnant frilla received no special care. She worked until labor began, gave birth with help only from other slaves, and returned to labor days later. Children born to frilla existed in a legal gray zone. They weren't automatically slaves, but they weren't free either. The master decided their fate. He could claim them as legitimate, reduce them to slavery, or expose them. Exposure meant leaving an unwanted infant in the woods to die. Women who had lived cloistered lives, shielded from men entirely, were now pushed through repeated pregnancies that wrecked their bodies. With no understanding of childbirth and no preparation, many died. Those who survived often suffered obstetric fistulas, internal injuries that caused permanent incontinence. There was no treatment in the 8th century. These women lived in constant pain, unable to escape, for the rest of their lives. But what broke the nuns most completely wasn't the physical damage. It was the forced corruption of their faith. The Vikings didn't just want their bodies. They wanted their souls. They forced them to take part in blot, helping slaughter animals and smear blood on pagan idols. They made them swear vows to Freya, praying for fertility. They forced them to learn Old Norse songs celebrating Viking victories and mocking the crucified god. Some nuns resisted for years. They whispered prayers in secret, fingered invisible rosaries, traced crosses in the air when no one was watching. The psychological pressure never let up. Their captors mocked them constantly, asking where Christ was now and why he hadn't saved them. If virginity had mattered so much, why had their God allowed it to be taken? After years of captivity and repeated pregnancies, doubt crept in. Some began to believe they had been abandoned, that their vows no longer applied, and that survival meant adaptation. That breakdown was often reinforced by the Viking wives. Many of them developed complicated relationships with their husbands' friller. Some saw the Christian women as rivals and treated them with brutal cruelty, beatings, burns from hot irons, forcing them into the most degrading labor. Others recognized that they were trapped in the same system, even if their positions were different. In those cases, a fragile form of solidarity emerged. Some wives taught the slaves Norse customs, shielded them from harsher punishment, and occasionally allowed them to hide small Christian symbols. A fragment preserved in a monastery library mentions a nun named Edgith. Historians believe this was the full Christian name of the girl later called Hilda. She was 15 when she was taken at Lindisfarne. In captivity, she gave birth 7 times. Only 2 of her children survived. She never stopped praying. Every night, quietly, she whispered the Pater Noster while her master slept. When she died at 34, her body broken by labor and childbirth, her master buried her with a small wooden cross she had carved in secret. He had converted to Christianity 3 years earlier. Because of her. Some nuns chose a different end. Suicide was a mortal sin under Catholic doctrine, but hell seemed preferable to the life they were living. They hanged themselves with leather cords when they could, threw themselves into frozen fjords, or swallowed poisonous berries gathered in the forest. The Vikings responded by developing countermeasures. Valuable slaves were watched constantly. Food was restricted to weaken them. Failed attempts were punished publicly. A woman who tried to kill herself was whipped in front of others, sometimes until she lost consciousness. The historical record of the Lindisfarne nuns is fragmentary. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe the raid but say almost nothing about the captives. A 9th-century Irish manuscript by Alcuin of York mourns the defilement of consecrated virgins, but gives no details. Only centuries later do hints appear in the Icelandic sagas. The Icelandinga saga mentions a Christian frilla named Hildegunna who could read Latin and taught her master's children. Egil's saga tells of an English slave woman who secretly kept her faith and eventually converted her owner before dying. Were these women the nuns of Lindisfarne? There's no way to know for certain. But the timeline fits. The sagas were passed down orally for generations, blending memory and myth. It's entirely plausible that some of the 23 nuns taken in 793 lived decades in captivity, bore Viking children and grandchildren, and survived only as distorted echoes in legend. What we do know is that this pattern repeated again and again over the next 250 years. Iona was attacked in 802, 806, and 825. Each time, captives were taken. Kildare was raided in 835. Monasteries across Ireland, France, Germany, and even northern Spain suffered the same fate. Coastal monasteries offered everything the Vikings wanted: gold and manuscripts, no serious defenses, and men and women who could be enslaved. And here's the final irony. These women, victims of violence meant to humiliate Christianity, likely did more to Christianize Scandinavia than any missionary ever did. They taught their children quietly. They preserved beliefs in secret. When Viking rulers began converting in the 10th century, many were influenced by mothers, grandmothers, and concubines who had never stopped believing. Saint Bridget of Kildare is said to have prayed that any nun captured by pagans would find the strength to keep her faith and eventually convert her captors. If those prayers were answered, they were answered through suffering she could never have imagined. The Vikings believed enslaving nuns proved their gods were stronger. Instead, Christianity took root inside their homes, carried unwillingly in the bodies of enslaved women. By the 12th century, paganism in Scandinavia was gone. Temples to Odin were destroyed. Priests converted or killed. Even the sagas were rewritten through a Christian lens. A bitter victory, paid for with the bodies of women who never chose martyrdom. In 2015, archaeologists excavating a Viking site in the Orkney Islands uncovered a woman's grave. She was buried with both a Christian crucifix and Thor's hammer resting on her chest. Isotope analysis showed she grew up in the British Isles but lived most of her adult life in Scandinavia. Her bones bore signs of repeated fractures consistent with domestic violence. She had given birth at least 6 times. Researchers believe she was likely a Christian woman, possibly a nun, captured young, enslaved for decades, and buried with symbols of 2 faiths, reflecting a life split in half by captivity. The nuns of Lindisfarne, and thousands like them, have no names carved in stone. No feast days. No official remembrance. The Church, unable to protect them, chose silence. The sagas remember them only as nameless slaves. But their bones lie in Scandinavian soil. Their DNA lives on in millions. Their stories survive only in fragments, distorted by time. They deserve to be remembered not as passive victims, but as women who endured the unbearable, preserved fragments of identity and belief, and unknowingly changed the course of history. Their suffering was real. Their resistance mattered. Their erasure was deliberate. Remembering them honestly is the last tribute we can still offer. This is Crown and Dagger. We don't soften history. We show what actually happened. Because the past isn't dead. It's waiting in the dark, waiting to be remembered. If you want more stories the world tried to bury, subscribe. And tell us in the comments what hidden history we should uncover next.